Good evening, everyone. I'm Parneet and I work with Ashoka University with the outreach team. I am going to be the moderator for today's session, the session by Ashoka's Center for Wellbeing, or the ACWB, which is a non-aligned center that offers counseling and psychological support for students, staff, and faculty at Ashoka University. The center operates by focusing its impact on the following factors: preventive, clinical, and promotional, which is to say, in addition to offering support for individuals facing mental health issues, the center prioritizes preventing the onset of mental health problems by promoting behavior change through information activities and workshops. As a center for excellence, we help other universities build smart spaces for students through training and capacity building exercises. It gives us great pleasure to share with you all that ACWB completes 5 years of serving not just the Ashoka family, but the larger community in the world, as well by promoting the value of positive mental health to improve individual coping capacity through skill building. Before I go on to introduce the speakers for today, I just would like to mention that some of the presentation questions or content of the webinar may be emotionally triggering for some people, as it mentions grief and trauma. We request you to please take care of yourselves. And if you wish to leave or ask a question anonymously, you can do so. You can also seek help from a counselor or a friend. Now, in the spirit of celebration and building a narrative of well-being for ourselves and the world around us, we bring you a webinar by Professor Dwight Jaggard from University of Pennsylvania and Dr. Arvinder J. Singh from Ashoka University. The webinar addresses the challenges we have faced in the last 19 months, the new realities, and some simple yet powerful tools to flourish the present and the future. I'll move on now and invite Professor Jaggard and Dr. Arvinder to take over and go ahead with the session.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. A very warm welcome to all of you. I'm indeed very, very happy and privileged to be joined with my colleague, if I may call him, but also somebody who I deeply regard and respect, Professor Dwight Jaggard, who actually brings a lot of hope and helps all of us build a lot of resilience through just his very presence. So today he's going to share with us a lot of techniques of how we can build on that. But before we go there, I think it would only be fair for us to really understand and see what has it been like in the last 19 months, as Parneet said. So I'm going to just take us through what has it been like for all of us. As we celebrate, I just wanted to share, the visual that we have, the icon that we have for the Center for Wellbeing. And this is something that one of our students has done, so I just like sharing it. So no other reason. At this point that we are in, 19 months, having gone through wave 1 and wave 2, having gone through all sorts of things that we probably have not experienced, in our day-to-day for a very, very long time, or probably the first time in our lives. There are a lot of emotions that we are grappling with, a lot. There's anxiety, and I think I could very safely say that at this point, all of us are on a spectrum as far as anxiety is concerned. It may be less or more, and what the pandemic has probably done has actually just moved people who were on a milder spectrum into a moderate and a severe spectrum. But having said that, all of us are somewhere on the anxiety spectrum. There's fear because a lot of us many of us actually, I wouldn't be, those of us connected from India, I can be very, very sure that we've all heard of or experienced some kind of loss of somebody we've known, maybe closely, maybe not so closely, but some sort of loss has happened of loved ones, of peers, of a grandparent, neighbor, anyone, if not, whatever. So there has been an intense sense of course, the isolation we're all familiar with, having to be in our spaces, something that we've not done, immense sense of fear, grief that comes with the loss, maybe anger as well, the sense of helplessness at not being able to do. And those of us who sort of witness people going through immensely difficult situations during the second wave, we know how helpless, how traumatized, how powerless, how a sense of loss of control gripped us. The loss, not just of control, but of maybe a sense of identity, of motivation, a kind of sadness, a despair that engulfed us, an extreme sense of exhaustion that a lot of people spoke about, both physical and emotional. A new feel, not a new feeling, but a very pertinent name to a feeling that Adam Grant, a psychologist, provides: languishing, where there is this lack of motivation, there is this sense of not wanting to do anything. There's not, so all of us have at some point or the other gone through it. Maybe we are going through it. Trauma and grief also have a way of surfacing many weeks or months after the devastating event, if I may call it, or the traumatic event. So many of these emotions we are grappling with, and at some point we feel that we are not really what we were earlier. And that need to feel that, that makes us feel less than who we are and makes us feel very inadequate, probably underconfident, probably what am I doing? What can I do? And do I lose hope in this? Which is why this whole business of how do we get this hope and resilience? Mind you, the fact that we have come this far, the fact that we are all sitting and talking about it, is because of this wonderful quality of resilience that we have. But it also is a space where sometimes we feel too tired and we need to reboot that system, which sort of gives us hope and resilience, and therefore this webinar today. What we need when we are feeling all of this grief, anguish, anger, anxiety, etc., we need our needs, our emotional needs are to feel safe and protected, to feel cared for. We need compassion towards ourselves, towards others, to feel that some people show that compassion to us, to feel connected, to be in control, whatever that means, given the times. A sense of emotional containment, which essentially means that, it's a very basic, a very fundamental human need to feel heard and understood. With whatever we are going through, we're not necessarily looking at solutions, we're looking at someone who really understands what I'm going through. And we need a sense of purpose. What isolation, what working from home has given us is kind of a structure which we can sort of fool around with in a lot of ways. And sometimes it makes us feel as if, do I have, where am I going with this? What is my purpose? How do I plan? And I often hear people now saying, I no longer make 5-year plans or 10-year plans, because that's what the pandemic has taught me, that your plans can go for a toss at any moment. Do I have a sense of purpose? Why am I here? What am I here for? We all need to feel productive. And even if there is output, sometimes we don't feel productive enough. And we need to feel like we're in it together. There is a sense of community. All these are very basic, fundamental human needs, some that we are aware of and articulate about, many that we may not be able to verbalize, but they're all the same there within us and need to be addressed. And in a time like this, when we have all these needs, it's like, where do we begin? How do we build this resilience? Where does hope start? And it actually starts with just the basics. The basics of just having a rhythm to the day. What does this rhythm do? It gives us a sense of purpose. When you have a wake up time and a sleep time, and there is a thing like, okay, I get up, I need to bathe, I need to go for a workout, etc., etc. All this gives us a certain sense of anchoring, a certain sense of purpose. Another very important thing, which we actually during the period of pandemic really lost, was a sense of boundaries. And if I were to really talk about boundaries in a very simple way. They actually just give a structure, a certain kind of border, a sense of groundedness, a sense of anchoring to us. And what I mean by boundaries is right now when people are working from home, we could be just doing just about everything, sitting on the dining table, not only having our meals, but also using it as our office space. Maybe our workstation is the same. Maybe we're sort of looking at many, many roles just in that same space. And what happens is when we have a lack of boundary, it just leads to exhaustion. Because sitting in that same space, you're getting into multiple roles, whether it's of a professional, of a parent, of a child, of a caregiver, of whatever it be. You're taking decisions to do with the home or to do with work just in that same place. And somewhere the boundaries are actually lost because there is no sense of when do we start the day, work day, when do we end the work day, when does our personal life start or end. And many a times, we are just spending endless time in one thing or the other without having to really focus and have a sense of a rhythm that the boundary gives us. Another thing, and these boundaries, these routines, these rituals, they seem like common words, something that we've been doing all the time. But actually, these are stuff that actually anchor us. For example, a routine. I mean, it helps us separate the different roles that we have. What I was talking about, the boundaries, like if you have a routine and if a different role, like when we went to work, we had a certain routine. We got ready, we packed our bag, we went to the bus station or sat in our car and we went to work and then we came. So there was a certain routine around it, which helped us with the boundary, like switch off or switch on into work or home situation. And that, if we lose it, we actually have a sense of exhaustion, an immense amount of stress. Getting the routine and boundary back, however simple or basic it sounds, you will be amazed at how profound an effect it can have on your sense of hope and on your resilience, the muscle that actually brings us back. I mean, I've been talking about resilience, and if I were to really define it in a word, it's actually the ability to bounce back from adverse situations. And it just leads us to getting in touch with our inner strength. And what we're talking about, the boundaries and the routines and the rituals, they help us get that sense of control and that sense of inner strength back. Because in the situation that we are, there has been a sense of a kind of powerlessness and helplessness. There's been this prolonged wait, like in India, we're still not back to our campuses for the students. People are still working from home in a lot of spaces, or it's a very, very, very quasi work situation. So all this has led us to a lot of maybe a sense of frustration, a lack of motivation, and a sense of as if nothing's in my control. What we can't control is what's happening outside, not so much, but what we can definitely control is how we spend our day. So boundaries, routines, and rituals help us define that day. So rituals, create like a sacred time and space for any of the activities that you may want to do. And a very simple thing which a lot of people have spoken about, and maybe you heard a lot of it, is being in the present moment. Taking time out for self-care, whatever that is, whether it's meditating, caring for a pet, dancing, journaling, writing, taking short breaks, seeing a friend, seeing a plant grow, exercising, just about anything. And I do know that a lot of my friends shared a lot during the pandemic time and especially the isolation and lockdown time, where they learned a new language, or they were baking a lot, or they were cooking new recipes or learning new games. Those were also a part of self-care, which actually, it's literally when you see a plant grow, it instills like a sense of hope. Seeing the cake bake, or cooking a meal, a new kind of a recipe, it actually gives you a sense of hope because you're literally seeing something grow, giving birth to something. It's almost that kind of space of hope and resilience. So these are some of the examples. No matter how basic they sound, they go a very long way in helping us get a sense of control. So when we are really talking about building hope and resilience, I've also found a lot of people saying, I don't feel productive enough. I'm not doing as much as I did earlier. Even though I don't have travel time, I have more time to myself, I'm still not as productive. We have to actually let go of that need, because whatever has happened in the last 19 months to us has had an impact on the psyche. And it would take some time for us to bounce back. And there is no really before pandemic and after pandemic kind of productivity, but it's about where you are now. And the context and the reality is very different now. So figure that in, and also look at it that the definition of productivity has to change. It has to be more progress oriented than how much you've achieved. The fact that you've been able to bring about some balance, the fact that you've been able to take time out for self-care, that you're alive, that you took care of your health, is a big one to factor right now. So let go of the need that you need to be more productive than you have been lately. And you have to be as productive as you were earlier, whatever that meant. See, what we are working with right now is multiple realities. We are working from home, and in our home are a lot of realities. For example, right now, I am home alone, and somebody might just ring the bell and I might have to answer the door, and that might just be my reality. And instead of really hiding that reality, it's important to integrate that reality, just like I shared. And if it were to happen that somebody were to ring the doorbell and I would have to go, instead of having to hide or be apologetic, I take you with me and give you, because there is nothing we can do. It could be that you're talking, or you're attending a class if you're a student, or if you're a faculty, you're teaching a class, or you're in your meeting and something happens in the background. There are cooking sounds, there is somebody who got into an argument, something happened. It's something that's very much a part of us, because the boundaries are now fuzzy. So we need to integrate these multiple realities which we are in, and operating from the same space. So instead of hiding, if you share, you build a kind of a language of empathy. And that, I think, is important. We create like a shared vocabulary when we integrate our realities. So we build a sort of a collective resilience through the shared vocabulary. The vocabulary which has empathy, where we understand, where we are not judged for any little something that happens that distracts us, where we actually are able to reach out and understand that space. And many times I've had, with my colleagues also, sometimes, their little child will come and wave and go away. And it's all right, we all sort of smile and have a little bit of a conversation, go back to work. It actually creates an empathy. It's a sense of empathy. Back in the day, meaning pre-COVID times, it's like we always felt that we cannot take our personal selves to our work. But the reality is we do take our personal selves to our work. Now what has happened is the workspace has come into our homes. So it is important that we remember that, and we build a sense of collective resilience through helping each other by respecting those spaces and creating this vocabulary which has empathy and hope, because that's what helps us build the resilience. Because what has also happened is, we've had our narratives now around the pandemic. We have a story. Each one of us has a story. Whatever we are today is as our story. It's a narrative we are putting up. The last 19 months may have put a certain kind of a spanner in your story. What are the narratives that you're putting up for yourself? The stories we tell us about ourselves and the others in the world, these stories actually dictate how we choose to live our lives. And this is where hope and resilience comes in. Because believe it or not, neuroplasticity has taught us we are no longer hardwired. We can still change and we can restory the story. So, and if required, we restory the story to restore faith, hope, and resilience. Because faith and hope are what anchor us, what give us a sense of purpose, what make us go, get up in the morning, jump out of bed, and say, this is how I'm going to take my day. So how do we work with this story? And how do we restory this story? most important is being aware of our feelings. There are numerous feelings. My first slide showed myriad feelings, and those were just not even 1/50th of the number of emotions that we could be feeling. It is important that we acknowledge we are feeling something. It is also important that we accept that feeling, whether it's anxiety or frustration or anger or hopelessness or joy or enthusiasm or ecstasy, whatever it is. Acknowledge the feeling, accept it, and frame it, and then act accordingly. And if you need to, and I just want to explain this through this, what we call the TFA cycle, the thought, feeling, action cycle. It's a very interesting cycle. It looks like a triangle though, but that's because I didn't know how to do a circle with it. But imagine that this is a circle. So the thought is, it's like, what are we but our thoughts, right? The thought just goes on and on and on, and we can't really have a control. And it's very annoying when someone says, think positive, because we really don't know how to do that. When everything around us is crumbling, it's very hard to think positive. And if you see, the way you think is the way you feel, right? The emotions that come are also related, they're triggered by our thoughts. If my thoughts are, the world is a big bad place, my feelings are going to be about, anxiety, or about, frustration, or about how do I get back to this world, or resentment. So the thought and the thought leads to feeling, and the feeling leads to thought, which is why the arrows are both sides, right? And if we don't have a control over the thought or the feeling, what do we do? So the thought leads to feeling, the feeling leads to thought, and the way you think and feel leads to the action. Yeah? Let me give you an example. So if you think that your day didn't start well, oh, I did get my newspaper, my day didn't start well, today is a lousy day, it's not just going to go well, everything is just, and you're going to feel angry, irritated, and what's going to happen is you're going to step out in a huff and maybe, maybe step on a stone or fall. And you're going to say, see, I knew my day was bad. And the thought will go to, again, that negative space. So the thought, feeling, and action, if you've had a bad day at work and you're feeling resentful, or you're feeling low, and your thought process is either the fact that my boss sucks, or, is very partial, doesn't take care of me, or whatever, or I'm angry, or I'm not good enough, the action is going to be either that you come home and you're angry with, a family member, or, your child, or whoever it is, and, the child might just go kick the dog, the pet, and the dog may go out and bite someone. So it just goes in a cycle. And the fact is, or the action could be you sulk. But if you have control, it is only on the action part, not on the thought, not on the feeling. It's very difficult to feel happy when your thoughts are all spiraling into a negative space. But the moment we choose an action, for example, if you've not had a great day and you're not feeling very good about it, and you choose to say, okay, I've not had a great day, but let me just go for a run. And if you go for that 30-minute run and come back, for sure, you're going to feel better. For sure, your thought pattern is going to change. And this is the cycle. If you can apply in your life, you'll see the story that I talked about. You have the power to change the story with just one small action that you can take. And that action could be anything. It could be to seek help. It could be to be of help. It could be anything. Seek help, if you're, and because sharing your emotional burden can actually give you perspective and inner strength. So talk to someone. This could be a friend, this could be a professional, this could be someone you really respect, but unburden and see how light you feel. Unburden not just with the goal of ventilating, but also of finding your inner strength. Because believe it or not, you have the best answers to your life. You have the best solutions to the problems that you're encountering. You have the best insights about yourself, and you and only you can help yourself in that. Others around you can actually be of some sort of help, but the ultimate responsibility and the ultimate potential lies within you. And someone who you speak with, will help you gain that inner strength. Another way of actually gaining that, that reclaiming the story is be of help to someone. Just listen to someone. Just listen without interrupting, judging, moralizing. It's like, you say a little something and somebody will give you advice. Really not required. For the most part, when somebody's sharing a story, the deepest need is somebody who can listen to me or understand. And I think that's where we really need to be of help to someone. And trust me, each one of you can be of help to someone. You do not need to be a professional to be of help to someone, to just listen without having to judge and moralize. So have constructive conversations around what kind of help can be there and what it can be, what it can look like. Just reach out and check in. Even just finding out how people are doing is actually very, very helpful. And going forward, I think we need global conversations which are, embedded in inclusivity, which use the language of empathy, which are anchored in purpose, and they look at progress, not victory, not how much you've achieved, but the fact that you're on the path. Stay connected with the sources of support. It could be a group, it could be someone you're helping, it could be a support group, it could be some kind of an NGO work that you're doing, you're helping someone. Any of these would be very, very helpful, because do remember that what each one of us is going through in terms of the anxiety and whatnot, and the grief and the trauma. And the trauma doesn't necessarily have to be direct, it's also vicarious. We are picking up all of this trauma of people around us who are sad, who are hurting, who are grieving, who are angry. That trauma also, our body just keeps picking. And sometimes we feel that we really need to know, it's too selfish to really show compassion to yourself. But really, I can't recall what article I was reading, but it was a beautiful one, which said, the compassion fatigue is not about we're tired of being compassionate to others, but it's actually we're not turning that lamp on ourselves. We're not showing compassion to ourselves, and therefore we feel exhausted. Remember, it's a shared collective experience we're all going through, and we're not alone in it. And knowing that we're not alone, knowing that we are there for each other, knowing that we can help each other, knowing that talking helps, knowing that simple techniques of self-care can help, knowing that routine, rituals, and boundaries can actually give you a great sense of control, will give you a sense that each one of you, each one of us can be a change agent. We can actually make a difference in our own lives as well as that of the others. There are also some very beautiful techniques which Professor Dwight Jagger will now get a talk about, which actually can be used on yourself and with others, which help us build this muscle of hope and resilience even further. So I'm going to stop here and going to hand it over to Dwight. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so very much. First, Parmi, thank you for moderating this session. And I especially want to thank Dr. Arvinder Singh for inviting me to join you and to congratulate her on 5 years for the Center of Wellbeing. Dr. Singh and I have known each other since the very beginning of the Center for Wellbeing, and it's such a wonderful resource for all of those who are at Ashoka University. So thank you so very much. Let me put up some slides then, as we're going to talk a little bit about some techniques and some things that you and I can do in order to enhance our own resilience. And so when we think about resilience, there are so many books that I've seen on resilience which say you must have resilience. Resilience is great, and all that is very wonderful. The question is, so how do we do that? A couple of things that Dr. Singh just mentioned resonated so much with me. I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that before we go any further, and that is the basics. Okay, I find that when students and myself don't get enough sleep, we don't perform very well. So things like sleeping and eating and moving and exercising, those are incredibly important for us, just as sort of a baseline before we think about any techniques. The idea of being an empathic listener, the idea of listening without judging, okay, very, very powerful if we want to be able to help and support other people. So I really appreciate all the context, Dr. Singh, that you gave. Context is everything, says Warren Bennis, and that's just a beautiful context for the things we're going to look at. I thought that today, here's our roadmap. I want to spend a little bit of time giving some context for 3 resilience methods or life hacks. And the context really comes from flourishing and well-being and positive psychology. And so I'm going to spend 3 minutes giving a little bit of background on that. And there are some resources if we have time at the end to think about that. Positive psychology came about because Marty Seligman, who was the president of the American Psychological Association in 1999, who had spent an entire career thinking about what makes people not flourish and how can we help that. In other words, how can we help those who are ill become better, wanted to spend the rest of his contributing lifetime to what is it that makes people who are basically okay or basically well, what makes them have enhanced well-being and flourishing. And so positive psychology is a scientific study of what allows people, you and I, to flourish and have enhanced well-being. It's emphasis on scientific study and empirical results from that, and it's really intended for those who are basically well, but for them to be better. That concept of flourishing. And when you take a look, the research is very active, started in 1999 and has been through the last several decades. There were 5 areas. You might think of them as ingredients. Okay, what are we going to put into sort of this well-being cake that we have? And so there's a lot of flour, positive emotion. There's that engagement. Are we absorbed by the things that we're doing? Relationships, incredibly important. It's relationships that support us, gives us connection to other people. Meaning, let's sprinkle in a lot of meaning into this flourishing cake. That's going to be important for us. And then finally, just simply accomplishment. When you and I accomplish things, it tends to enhance our own sense of well-being and flourishing. And so if you feel that at the moment you may not be flourishing or have enhanced well-being, you might think about, is there one of these areas that I might work on? And so it might be that you've been very absorbed in your studies. And so there's a lot of accomplishment going on, but you have let languish just a little bit your relationships. And so you may want to reconnect to those who support you. So these are the ingredients, and it gives us a context because it's out of this positive psychology that so much of the recent work on resilience has come. And I wanted to have you have just a little bit of that background. When we think of happiness, by the way, happiness not in the smiley face sense, but in the sense of flourishing and being fulfilled and having increased well-being, there's some very positive news. About 50% of our happiness comes from our set point, sort of how is it that we were born, nature and nurture, how we grew up, but there's 40% which is open to our intentional activity. That is, the things that you and I do. And so we're going to be looking at what is it. You can think of them as interventions. I'm going to do something to change, okay? We have access to that 40%, which determines our happiness. I think of this in an incredibly positive way. You and I have access to 40% of our own sense of well-being through thinking about some of the things that we're going to be talking about in this webinar. And to me, that's incredibly positive. The other piece to this is that the recent research on resilience is also incredibly positive. And that is some 55 to 85% of people who go through very significant trauma bounce back. And that's what resilience is all about. Resilience is that bouncing back from an adversity or from a setback or an obstacle. And so with this is giving just a little bit of context. And remember, positive psychology is not the smiley face. It really has to do with being fulfilled, flourishing, having a sense of well-being, and that deep sense of happiness. You and I, if you will, have some levers, some things that you and I can do. And of course, we can also go for help to professionals if we need something more. So what I'd like to do, as Dr. Singh mentioned, is talk about 3 things that you and I can do. I'm going to just call them resilience life hacks, okay? 3 resilience interventions, if you will. That is things that you and I can do, and they're pretty straightforward. And they're things that you and I can do to help us to bounce back. So let's take a look at the first one. The first one is temporal distancing. It's the magic of time travel, okay? Some strategies to down-regulate negative affect, that is, if we're feeling down, some strategies are simply to vary the temporal closeness, give ourselves some distance, okay? What happens if we imagine ourselves into the future? Or the physical closeness, it's happening very far away, or even the emotional closeness. And I want to think about, in particular, varying the temporal closeness. It's that concept of the magic of the time machine. And so there's a cute video on a 1-minute time machine. Let's give a little bit of a listen as we think about how you and I have our own time machines that we might implement. Here's the video.
Excuse me. Do you mind if I,
Free country. What's that?
Oh, nothing.
Sure it's not a 1-minute time machine?
Huh? Damn it. Excuse me. Do you mind if I,
It's free country. What's that?
Well, it certainly isn't a 1-minute time machine. Damn it. It's my lunchbox.
It's weird. I like weird.
Cool. I'm Lanes. I'm James.
James. Are you trying to pick me up?
No, come on. Do I look that strong?
Are you trying to pick me up?
Yes. I'm trying to.
Try harder.
Hi.
Harder.
Coffee.
Harder.
Dinner. Let me go back to my place.
Right now?
Okay, a time machine in action. You and I have, in a sense, that time machine which we can implement ourselves. And that is to regulate emotion, think about things will look in the future. It's a temporal distancing. It's been shown to be very effective in reducing emotional distress. And this is what it looks like. Okay, when something occurs, which is a setback or adversity, we think about what is it going to look like 10 or even 20 years from now? I remember I implemented this, I guess, naturally when I was a young assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. It was one of my first years. It was around 1980, 1981. And a student received a B+ in my very challenging course that I taught. And at that time, when long-distance telephone calls were very expensive, the student's mother decided to call me at home for 45 minutes from Singapore. So someone was investing a lot of money in trying to change her son's grade. And I remember saying to that mother, you know, whether there's a B+ or an A-, when this student who's 21 years old is 40, it's not going to make any difference in the universe whether the grade in my course is a B+ or an A-. That's temporal distancing. It's looking and projecting ourselves into the future and looking back. You might even think about, are there some positive things that might come from this event, this adversity, this obstacle that I have? What opportunities might come because this direction is blocked? Might there be other opportunities? You can even mix that in with a little bit of emotional distancing and think about, what would someone who's very smart say to me? That is, if this were occurring to someone else, what might I say to them? And so you and I have the ability, our time machine that we can use in our mind, and we can use our cognitive powers to project ourselves into the future and get a sense. Here's how this might look. For example, I just received my exam back. I was hoping to increase my GPA this semester, but instead I received a grade of a C. I'm upset, disappointed, and angry. What's the intervention? Well, you might project yourself into the future. When I'm 40 years old, will it make any difference what the exact grade is that I got in this course? What other opportunities might there be? Maybe there's a motivation for me to study just a little bit harder. How would my brilliant friend handle this? I would say, hey, it's one exam. Don't get too excited about it. So temporal distancing, even mixed with some of the other distancing that we have, might be useful. There's another example. I've just been looking forward to getting my dream job. I got the offer, but I just found out that the job offer has been rescinded. I'm upset. I'm disappointed. I'm angry. And again, I might think about, hey, when I'm 40 years old, 20 years from now, will this make any difference? There'll be lots of other opportunities. In fact, maybe my very wise friend will say to me, Dwight, there are lots of other things that you can do. You even have other job offers. Why don't you look and see which one is the most attractive one for you? So emotional temporal distancing can work together very nicely, but that distancing means that you and I have our own time machine. The results from the research are that when we project ourselves into the future, it reduces distress. And secondly, the further we project ourselves in the future, the more effective is the temporal distancing. So, one very simple resilience hack, projecting ourselves into the future, giving ourselves another perspective in looking at things. The second hack is knowing our ABCs. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, said, hey, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Okay? And so again, we're going to think about what is it that we can do in using our cognitive abilities to modulate our reaction to the things. Frankl, who wrote the wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, said between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power. You and me have this power to choose our response. And our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so the ABC method thinks about how we're going to respond and how we're responding in ways that are correct. Has a wonderful history. Aaron Beck is the originator of cognitive behavioral therapy. It came from wonderful work by Albert Ellis. I love Ellis. Ellis, as a young man, was afraid of meeting young women, and so he invented rational emotive behavior therapy in part to help him meet young women. And apparently it was very successful. And then Martin Seligman. And so these are some of the pioneers who really followed the Stoic philosophers in thinking about the ABCs. A, for the adversity or the activating event. B, for our belief about that. And then C, what happens as a consequences, particularly of our belief. So let's take this apart just a little bit and take a look at what typically happens. Thinking on the left-hand side about an activating event. Dr. Singh had a circular event. I'm sort of taking that circle and laying out along a line so that we can see what often happens. In adversity, that activating event comes along. And then there's our belief. That's the middle part of this. And there's an internal chatter. Our brain tells us things. Some people call it a ticker tape that's going. Some people call it chattering in the brain. I was talking to one young India fellow during this past several weeks on a one-on-one, and the fellow said, it's like there's a woodpecker in my head telling me I'm not good enough. Okay, so whatever model you want to think about, it's that chatter, it's that unconscious, but it can be very destructive. And because of those beliefs, there are consequences. There are consequences in how we feel, what we do, reactions, how we view what happened. William James, America's first psychologist, said, hey, the greatest discovery of my generation is that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes. As you think, so shall you be. And if you're interested in a really excellent biography, read the biography of William James, a true genius. You might think in advance about what are some of the adversities that sort of push your buttons, okay, that trigger some of these negative thoughts and beliefs that are actually incorrect. Maybe they're conflicts. Maybe it's juggling too many things. Maybe there's emotions, dealing with our own anger and sadness and despondency, some of the things that Dr. Singh just talked about. Maybe it's some good things, okay, that actually come along. Successes also can bring their own sense of stress. So I like this list because it just gives sort of that possibility of some of the things that come along that we might view as some kind of activating event. And then the beliefs which come from that. Here's a really simple explanation of how that ABC works. Let's give a listen.
How well do you deal with setbacks at work? Do you let them throw you off course and affect the rest of your day? Or are you the type of person who deals with adversity constructively? Research shows that people who are optimists handle setbacks more effectively than those who are pessimists. This can affect how successful they are in life. Fortunately, you can learn how to be more optimistic. One way to do this is by using Dr. Martin Seligman's ABC technique. ABC stands for adversity, beliefs, and consequences. In short, we first encounter adversity. How we think about this creates beliefs. These beliefs then influence what we do next, so they become consequences. For example, imagine your boss gave you some negative feedback on a presentation you made to the board. This is adversity. If you're pessimistic, you might then think you're no good at your job. You then avoid giving presentations, which affects your career progression. This is a consequence. The key point happens between A and B. When you encounter adversity, how you explain it to yourself has a direct impact on your mindset and on your relationships.
And so we hear here something about our explanatory style. And it comes in this BC connection, okay? In particular, our beliefs. Oftentimes, we'll know what the consequences are. So I find this table incredibly helpful. Consequence is anger. Oftentimes, we aren't aware of the belief. And this helps us to get our belief, and then we can evaluate, is that belief correct? When we're angry, it's usually because of a violation of rights, okay? When we're sad or depressed, it's some kind of loss, a real world loss or something intangible, okay? Loss of self-worth, for example. When there's guilt, okay, it's a violation of someone else's right. And when there's anxiety, it's usually about the future, right? I'm anxious about some future threat, something that may happen to me. And when there's embarrassment, it's usually because of judgment, because of a negative comparison to others. And so the right-hand side, you and I may be able to see very easily, but it may be the left-hand side that we need access to. And this simple chart can give us that access. I'm going to just bypass the slides having to do with the right-hand side, the consequences of anger, sadness, guilt, anxiety, fear. But I just would like to look at a couple examples and then see what it is that we might do. So your boyfriend or girlfriend asks you to be available each evening of the weekend and you feel angry. I look down at the chart and say, violation of rights. So I may be thinking he or she is taking away my right to decide what I want to do. And so we look at the anger, we use the chart to get back at the belief. Another example that we have, my boss criticizes me, or boss criticizes you. I fear embarrassment. I look down at the chart, embarrassment, negative consequence, or comparison to others. So I'm being judged in comparison to others, okay? That helps me to get at this belief, okay? My boss thinks that others might be better than me. That belief may be correct, but it's very possibly incorrect. And so the ABC method is getting us to think a little bit about, are the beliefs correct? Oftentimes, the 3 P's will come in. These are explanatory factors. We'll say, oh, this is permanent. That is, this always happens to me, or it's pervasive. If I fail in this, I'm a failure in all things. Or personalization. I'm responsible and blamed for everything. And so what we want to do is to avoid these 3 P's, and oftentimes they'll be kind of a cascade. Whereas there's a belief that because some adversity or obstacle appeared, okay, I'm to blame, or this always happens to me, I'm a failure in everything. It goes on all of the time. Fortunately, Seligman and Ellis knew that there were more letters in the alphabet than ABC. And so they introduced ABC, DE. And D is the disputation of the incorrect belief. And so we can use our cognitive powers, okay, to actually change the way that we feel by correcting incorrect beliefs. Okay, so we argue with ourselves, is that really correct? Am I really to blame? Or we can then change the outcome, which is there. Here's an example of an activating or adverse event. You have a very demanding workload and you're asked to lead another new project. Your belief that you look at is, I must agree to every request that's made of me, especially if it's made by my boss. The consequence, if we look at it, is that I'm stressed and anxious, okay? And then I can dispute this and say, wait a second, let me go back to my belief. Is that correct? And you realize I don't have to agree to every request that's made of me, even if it's from my boss. And there's a new outcome. And that is, I will agree to reasonable requests that are made of me. Not every request, but reasonable ones. Okay? And so that disputation, the D, incredibly important. We go back and we dispute or argue with our belief. Is that belief correct? I must agree to every request made to me? No, I don't have to. Okay? But I should agree to things which are reasonable, and so there'll be a judgment. Another example, you get a low mark on a major paper for a graduate course. Your belief is, oh, I won't finish my degree. This will doom me, okay? Consequence, I'm anxious and I'm stressed. I lose motivation for all of my courses. And then I dispute this and say, wait a second, does that really mean I won't finish my degree if I get a low mark in one paper? Okay, I didn't do well in the paper, but I did well in high school. I was admitted to the university. I did well enough on my standardized exams. I had people who gave me recommendations, okay? It's that sort of imposter syndrome that comes in, okay? I really don't deserve to be here, okay? And then you dispute that. Of course I do. There's evidence, and I'm going to use that evidence, use the cognitive portion of my brain to challenge that belief and therefore have a new outcome. And that is, I am smart. The evidence is all there. And I will need to put in more work, though, on future papers. And so it begins to give us a little bit of balance. In the late 1970s, I'd gotten my PhD, and I was ready to go out in the job market. I was a postdoc, and I had 3 strikeouts, okay? One institution, I very badly wanted to be a professor there. It was where I'd done my undergraduate work, and that didn't work out. Another one turned out to be a part-time job. They really didn't want someone to be there permanently. It was like a 1 year, and that was not going to work out with what I was looking for. And a third one, there was a tremendous cultural mismatch between me and the institution. Professors went out to lunch and talked about how many head of cattle they had, and I realized that this is not the environment necessary that I want to be spending my next 30 or 40 years. And so I had a belief after those 3 strikeouts that I was no good, okay? Not good enough, okay? And the consequence is that I kind of withdrew from the process for a little bit. Like, I'm never going to get a job. This always happens to me. I'm not good enough in anything. I will never get a teaching job or be asked to come to a university. And then I disputed it, okay? I said, wait a second. I just got a PhD from Caltech. That's a great place. I have a wonderful research record. I've given presentations all over the United States on my research for my PhD. I can do this. And of course, I went back on the job market and got several offers and ended up here at the University of Pennsylvania eventually. And so there was a different effect. It allowed me to re-enter the challenging work. So the idea of disputation is, when appropriate, avoid things such as permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. I'm always to blame. I'm a failure in all things. This always happens to me. There's some places where you don't want to use the ABCs, okay? And that is if you're planning for a risky future or you're involved in advising someone about their risky future. Okay, if you want to express empathy, okay, someone's had a loss, you want to express empathy, ABCs is not the place to do that. It's not at the beginning. So there are places where you don't want to do it, and there are places where things are truly dangerous and risky. Okay, so if you're in the armed services and you're looking at your friend who's getting ready to defuse a bomb, you don't want to say, hey, no problem with defusing that bomb. You shouldn't be so nervous. Perhaps there's real reason for that person to feel very nervous. Okay. And our third one is gratia. Okay. Mark Twain has this wonderful quote. I've had many tragedies in my life, some of which actually happen, okay? And this is for those of us who tend to catastrophize. The first arrow, which we can't avoid, is a familiar and unpleasant everyday experience. That's going to be the pain. What we can avoid is the suffering which comes after it. It's a second arrow. The magnified thoughts and feelings that we come from the first arrow when you look at the worst case scenario. It's that catastrophizing. We immediately go to the second arrow to think about the worst case. So there's the original pain. You and I can't avoid that. That will occur in our life. It's simply a matter of living and being human. But the suffering, okay, looking and going immediately to the worst consequence, we can avoid. So Gratza is getting rid of the second arrow, okay? First arrow comes, but we don't have to dwell on it. And let's take a look about how we can feel the pain, which we can't avoid, but we can avoid the suffering. And there are 5 easy steps. And this is best done to write it down. A lot of times we'll say, oh, we'll take a shortcut and just think about it. I encourage you to actually write it down. Worst case scenario, how likely is it? What's the best case scenario? And then what's the most likely outcome? And then plan for that most likely outcome. So here's 2 examples. Here's the first one. Hey, I forgot to read the assignment, and now there's a pop quiz, okay? And so the worst case belief is I fail a pop quiz, I'll fail a course, I won't graduate, I won't get my dream job, companies won't hire me, I'll have no money, no friends, I'll end up without housing, life becomes meaningless, I die homeless and friendless, okay? That's like the race to the bottom, possible worst case. And I take a look about like how likely is this, okay? Well, I probably will fail the pop quiz. There's probably 80% or 90% chance that I'll do that, but the other things are very unlikely. What's the best case scenario? The best case scenario is that despite not studying, despite not reading, I do wonderfully on the pop quiz. I get my degree. I'm hired by the most prestigious multinational consulting firm. I make vice president and I retire incredibly wealthy at age 42. Probably is not going to happen, just like the worst case is probably not going to happen. So let's take a look then. What is the most likely outcome? Most likely outcome is I probably won't pass the quiz. This may cause me not to get the A- I was hoping for, but a B+ instead. But I'll graduate, I'll get a job, I'll have friends, I'll find meaning in my life. And the solution is, hey, in the future, if you want to be prepared for pop quizzes, read the assigned material, which is there. Okay. Here's another example. I'm at work. I'm in sales, and I forgot to send out the sales brochures to a wonderful prospective client. Okay. Worst case belief, I'll lose some calling time. So that means I won't make the sales calls that I planned on, which means I won't get leads, which means I will have no sales, which means there's no commission. I'll be starved out of my job. I'll go through a succession of failed jobs. I'll lose my house. My spouse leaves me. I'll be homeless and living on the streets. Okay. It was like, how likely is that? Well, I probably will lose some calling time because somehow I've got to get these brochures to the client. So that's relatively likely. The other things, highly unlikely. You want to have some fun? You look at the best case. You say, okay, I got fired, so I take my severance, I move to California, I set up a software company, there's an IPO, and I become a multi-billionaire. Again, not so likely, okay? But not any more likely or unlikely probably than the worst case scenario. So let's look at a more realistic case. And the realistic case is, yeah, I have to get the brochures ready tomorrow. So I'm going to lose 1 or 2 hours. I may have to go in early. My boss is going to be unhappy with me and may rant and rave. And so I'm going to have to contend with my boss. The solution, get to work early, prepare the brochures, notify the client, inform your boss, and tell your boss what you've done. So Gratza is for those of us who want to super catastrophize, always go to the worst place. And what allows us to do is use our cognitive abilities to avoid that. 5 easy steps. Write them down. What's the worst case? 2, how likely is that worst case? 3, what's the best case? 4, what's the most likely case? And then let's deal with a solution, number 5, for that most likely case. If you're in my class, at the end, all young fellows know this, I offer my $3,000 takeaways. That is, you spent some time, I've spent some time when I'm working with executives, they spent time in their salary because they've flown in for our session together, and you should get $3,000 worth for our 30 minutes that I've had with you. So if you don't get your $3,000 worth, be sure to contact me. I want to hear from you. Here are the takeaways from what we've just been talking about. Positive psychology is about flourishing and well-being. It provides a context for this idea of resilience. You and I can change how we feel by changing how we think. Okay, we can use our thinking cognitive skills to actually change our false beliefs and the way that we feel. And then equip yourself with whatever technique works for you for resilience. Think about the three that we've talked about: temporal distancing, knowing your ABCs, or Grazia, and think about how you'll use that. Well, Parmeet, I'm going to turn it back to you. If you have, by the way, any questions or you want to contact me, I have my email at the bottom of the right-hand side, jaggard@seas.upenn.edu, and I'd love to hear from you. But with that, Parmeet, I will turn things back to you as moderator. Thank you for your help.
Thank you so much, Professor Jaggard. And I'm sure the audience has got worth more than $3,000 worth with two experts here. So thank you so much for that wonderful session. We were all listening very intently, and we have some very interesting questions. And I'm going to pose the first question to you. So Professor Dwight, how would you define trauma? Does it always have to be something big or significant, or even small things that happen in your daily life can be classified as trauma?
I think of letting the individual decide what trauma is. And so when I've surveyed students all over the world, have you had significant trauma in your life? So these would be people who are roughly 20, 22 years old. Something like 50 to 75% of them identify that for them, they've had significant trauma. So it's that event which for some person might not be a trauma for them, but for the individual who's responding, it is a trauma for them. And for some people, small events, because there's been a number of them over a long period of time, like through this pandemic, then a smaller event may be seen as a trauma. And for others, where life is going very well, it may take a much larger event for things to be seen as a trauma. I leave it really to the individual. What is it that's been traumatic for you?
It's very contextual, as I could understand. Yeah. Okay, so we have another question here, which says, how do you start conversations with strict parents, and especially when they have stress and they're frustrated themselves? So which one? I think
Dr. Singh, you want to start
Dr.
off with that
Arvinder
one?
is a...
Okay. So, well, like I said, you're not alone. Many of us sitting over here will tell you what strict parents can be all about, and I'm sure we all have stories on that. So, yeah, but having said that, it can be very difficult to open a conversation with a parent who, and when you say strict, I'm also hearing with very fixed views, perhaps, right? It can sometimes be very frustrating because you may feel unheard by them. And so when you have to open a conversation with somebody like that, just step back to see that somebody who is strict and is sort of fixed in their opinions, perhaps. I mean, I'm reading that into it, where the boundaries are very, very strong and there's no space for negotiations. These are people who have probably get a sense of control on their anxiety or any other emotion through having this kind of rigidity. So if you understand that space and bring in the empathy for that, which might be a little tough, and you might need to talk to a professional on how to bring that, because here are your emotions as well as a child. And I cannot deny that in this parent-child relationship, your emotions as a child, no matter what your age is, are important. So seeing how you're feeling, dealing with those emotions of frustration or of being blocked out by a parent, or, that can have its own set of emotional problems for you. Once you deal with that, it will enable you to see their world and pick up a space of communication which they understand the best. Yeah, it's like, speaking the language that they can understand, right? Not being strict with strict, but first addressing your own emotions, because that is where I think there is a larger area of where we can make a difference. So seek out, talk to someone. There are many helplines. Um, there are counseling services. If you're an Ashoka student, there is Ashoka Center for Wellbeing, where you can book an appointment with a counselor and talk about it. But with a strict parent, what I'm hearing is also there must be a whole set of problems in communication and relationship that you may be experiencing, which also need addressing. So please do seek out that.
I would just add also a few words. And I love the idea of understanding where your parent is coming from, and that idea of control, which often is, as you mentioned, is a way for them to address their own anxiety and to address their concern for you as the child. Okay? They love you dearly and they have concern for you, and may be expressed in ways that are no longer appropriate as you're growing older. And so you can have conversations where you say, do you have some time, mom or dad? I have something important that I'd like to speak with you about. So you decide on a time, and then I think it's fine to acknowledge, this is very difficult for me to even bring up. And I know you love me, but I suspect it's going to be difficult for you as well. And so we acknowledge kind of the feelings that are in the ether, they're in the atmosphere, and we acknowledge that, and then we begin to move forward. If I'm going to have a difficult conversation, I'll often role play with a trusted friend, okay? And so that there's a chance for me to have a, if you will, pre-conversation, okay? In order to sort of role play, and that friend can be my parent, okay? And role play. So I think, yeah, there's some great things using outsiders as well. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Dwight and Arvinder. I remember one of your sessions that you did spoke about languishing, and coincidentally, that was the day I'd read the article on languishing. So we even have a question on that, which says, how do we know whether we are languishing or just being lazy? And actually, that is something I was also wondering, really. So could you please take that?
Sure. So one of the things about languishing will be this general meh feeling, right? And meh is just the word that describes it. And whereas it's lazy, it's just a very definite, no desire to do. I'd rather sleep than this. Whereas in languishing, there is a very definite sense of lack of motivation. There's no joy in the heart. There's no sense of connection with anything. It doesn't have to be work. It just has to be, there's this lack of sense of that connection with anything that you may want. Yeah. And you're constantly just aware of this low sense of motivation, but not knowing what to do and just sort of wondering what's happening. And there's a definite sense of maybe a guilt around that, of just not being motivated enough. So that's how you can distinguish languishing from just being lazy, where there's a task, but I'd rather sleep and do it.
Okay, yeah, that clarifies a lot of things. How does one manage ruminative thinking?
Right, you want to take that, or you want me to take that?
I send all the difficult questions to you, Dr. Singh. You know that. So I'm going to give that one to you.
So ruminating happens when, in a sense, we're actually just thinking in a loop. Okay? And it just goes on in that kind of a space. And to stop ruminating, just think of that triangle that I want you to imagine as a circle, which is thought, feeling, and action, right? So now when you're stuck in that thought part, what is it that you can do in terms of action? And a very small action, like occupying your hands. It could be just organizing your cupboard. It could be cooking, cleaning. It could be, if your cupboard is already organized, then, color code it. whatever it is, but occupying your hands somehow with an activity which does not require too much decision making, creative decision making, but is, it actually pulls you out of the loop of just ruminating. Also, what happens is, when we have some of the practices that most of us are aware of being mindful, of being in the present moment, actually helps us move from that space, because ruminating is also like going back in a space. And then when you're ruminating, you don't really have to do anything. You just have to be in that space. So practices such as being in the present moment or mindfulness, and many of it are informed by positive psychology, they help you be in the here and now and are a very good antidote to ruminating. So occupying your hands, being in the present moment, actually a smallest example of being in the present moment was, if at this moment, just drop everything and just look at what you're looking, hear what you can hear, be aware of the lights and sounds and the colors around you. Just this will actually take you away. And it's basically breaking that cycle to then move into. It might come back again. It's not like it's going to be a permanent cure, but we have to do just the same thing again, pretty much like brushing our teeth every morning, no matter what. Mm-hmm. And if you practice good dental hygiene, then maybe many more times during the day. So it's like having to do that and make sure that it's not that it's going to go away, but slowly the brain learns to make those neural connections. And then the ruminating, the time becomes shorter and shorter and shorter till it becomes not very significant, or it doesn't really hamper. Because what is important is, what is ruminating doing to your day or to your present life? If it's not helping you engage with this moment or do something, or it's actually making you just sort of sit back and just see life pass by, then we need to get to that. Understand what the impact is. See what tiny little action you can take and change the story. Like I said, restory the story to restore your own inner strength.
That's really the key, I think, inner strength. There is another very interesting question. Both of you have already covered part of it, which is dealing with parents and difficult parents. So the other part to that question is, how can we as students work on our emotional intelligence? And emotional intelligence is something we're hearing a lot about these days. So if you could just help with that, I think I can request Professor Dwight to take that.
So emotional intelligence, indeed, there's been a lot written about it ever since Goleman, a psychologist at Rutgers University, wrote his pioneering book. And then in addition to emotional intelligence, there's another one on social intelligence, and I'm sure there'll be many other intelligences that will come along. And Goleman did not discover emotional intelligence, but Goleman was the popularizer of it. And the idea is a very simple one, and that is, I can sit next to someone who's very smart and I don't get smarter, okay? I could pass Einstein on the street. Actually, my parents did that when they were in Princeton. They would pass Einstein, who had an ice cream cone in Princeton, New Jersey, and they would pass him. They got no smarter because they were close to Einstein. But emotions are catching. And so I can be in a room in which everyone is having a great time, and someone can come in who's down or sad or depressed and bring the whole level, if you will, sort of squelch the party. And so the idea is, if emotions are catching, intelligence is not, but emotions are there positive ways in which we can use them? And so Goleman writes then about things like first simply being aware of our emotions. And that's why I love the slide that Dr. Singh had very close to her presentation of, here are some of the things you may be feeling. And there are all these words of sadness and anger and low self-confidence and so on. The list goes on. And the number of adjectives are in the thousands, literally. Okay? And so one of the first things we can do is simply to be aware. And then the second thing that Goleman suggests is being able to regulate our emotions. And of course, we can't regulate them unless we know what they are. And so there's this idea of knowing what we're feeling. And I love the idea of having a rich list even to choose from, okay? Because we can be very granular. Here's exactly how I'm feeling now. And then if we're aware that we have anger, it's only then that we might say, I want to modulate that down. Or I have sadness. Is that really what I want to bring into this group? Or I have anxiety. Do I want to bring everyone down, or can I use it in a positive way and be thinking about plan Bs, which is a great way to think about if you're a pessimist or you're very anxious, you're the plan B person, okay? But use it in a very positive way. And then talk about things like motivation, motivating yourself and others, empathy, okay, that ability to listen without judgment, okay, not leading the conversation, but identifying emotions and feelings. And so these are the components then that go into emotional intelligence. Very few leaders have all of them, but most leaders have some of them. And so I think what makes sense is not, I want to be like that person, but the question is, what kind of leader do I want to be? What are the emotional intelligence pieces that I have? And it might be that you have the ability to be very empathetic. You know how to listen to others without judgment, hearing them, not leading the conversation, but instead of following the conversation, being a mirror of the emotions, not just what's said, but also what's felt. Okay? And so then let's make use of that set that you have, which is empathy. The final one of the emotional intelligence is, like Goleman talks about, is social skill. And some students have that and some students don't. If you have that, it's great. It's that ease that you have. In working, you can talk to anyone about anything. And in the process of having a social interaction, you may be, if you're in a workspace, even accomplishing some, quote, business. I used to have someone that I reported to at the University of Pennsylvania who had great social skill. And you'd be walking in the hallway and say, Dwight, I want to talk to you about something. You have a very nice conversation. When everything was finished, you just realized, whoa, some business was just transacted and just had that ease. I wasn't even aware of it at the time. And that's the fifth one of the emotional intelligence. So I would encourage people to think about, which ones do you have? Which ones are your best ones, your strongest ones, and then develop those to the maximum extent that you can.
How do we manage perfectionism that doesn't allow us to rest without guilt? So I think I'm going to pass that to Dr. Arvinder.
So the voice was cracking, but if I heard it correct, how do we manage perfectionism without feeling guilty?
That's right.
Okay. So one of the things about perfectionism is, at the base of it is anxiety. The anxiety actually propels, the stress propels you to do, things in a certain way and the best. And just like I said, eventually all of us are really looking for that sense of control, of how do I control. And with perfectionism, a lot of the time there is a part in us which feels control if things are done in a certain way. And perfectionism is defined individually by the person. What do I think as perfect? And how do I take care of my anxiety by ensuring that every bit of how I want is in a certain way, right? That takes away a lot of the emotional energy. And the guilt that is connected with it is about either not being able to do that in a way that you want to, or taking too much time, or it may be at someone else's expense. So how do we take care of perfectionism? Like we pointed out just now in the previous questions, I'll be aware of that emotion, okay, of the need to be perfectionist. Where is it coming from? Is it anxiety? So name it, frame it, and then come up with a creative solution to it. And that again links us to the thought, feeling, action cycle. That the action that you really develop, what does perfectionism mean? What ultimately is, and I like, the question that Dwight had sort of put, that what does it look like, 10 years from now? So the same way, how is this helping me with eventually my goal? And it is something that would need you to have a conversation with someone who can help you understand where is this need coming from. there are two things you talk about. One is perfectionism, the need to do things in a certain way, because it could well be because you need, there is, we all need approval, we all need some kind of acknowledgement. And I think who is it that you need that approval from? What is it that's saying to you about your own self? And the guilt that comes because you in your own eyes probably feel you don't measure up there. And the fact that you have to get to the bottom of those emotions requires conversation. So there can't be a magic solution of something that, that will go away. The fact is that this perfectionism has served your purpose so far. Okay, but it's now becoming like a little bit of a problem, which is why the question, which is why the guilt. And that is what needs to be decoded by you for yourself with the help of a professional, I would suggest. And to look at it, again, I said, name it, frame it, put it in a context, and then take the action. Any creative solution that you can look at. And that's something you require help for.
So Dr. Arvinder, I'm sorry.
And I had just a comment on that.
Sure.
And I really like the idea of naming it and trying to figure out. I think that perfectionism and procrastination often get linked together, and so it kind of becomes a double whammy. And you don't want to start the project because it can't be perfect. And so a lot of that is bound up in that anxiety and also fear of judgment. If I do this, I will only be judged, I'll only be good enough if I do this perfectly. One of the strategies that I've suggested for people is you may want to think of selective perfectionism. And so when my brain surgeon operates on me, I want her to be perfectionistic, okay? I want to be very perfectionistic. But in the United States, we mow our own lawn. And that doesn't happen in India, but we do. So I'm out there, I mow my lawn. I don't have to be perfectionistic for that. So if I tend towards perfectionism, which I do, okay, I can decide also that there are areas where I don't need to be perfectionistic. And then there may be things having to do with courses that I would like to be perfectionistic. So I think also the idea of selective perfectionism is one way. It doesn't get at the deeper issues, but it's sort of a short-term strategy or just a tactic that we'll use for today.
Thank you, Professor Dwight. And I'm so sorry, we have a couple of more questions, but we're really short on time. So I'm just going to request you both, if you could please suggest some books that you can recommend. And in fact, you can put your suggestions in the chat box for understanding and cultivating positive psychology. So I think if you can just put some names in the chat box, the audience can take them from there. And if I give you 2 minutes to just answer this one last question about being able to recognize your own trauma. How do you recognize your own trauma? Because it might go unnoticed, but the effects can last even when you're a grown-up. So if you could quickly end with that last question.
Sure.
I'm going to let Dr. Singh take that.
Okay, so while Dwight is typing out the books for you, I'll quickly handle this one. So it's a very good question because sometimes, trauma, sadness, they just get intermixed. And sometimes trauma is so embedded in our DNA that we don't even realize it's happening. You may have heard of the word PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where the symptoms are even more exaggerated, where you may have some of these symptoms like maybe, your sleep, your appetite is impacted. You have hypersensitivity, you're hypervigilant, like, you actually, at a little sound, you have a very extreme reaction where you may, for no apparent reason, maybe, burst into tears, where anyone else's pain can actually trigger you and have that kind of a vicarious response in you. In your body, you will feel these aches and pains which are undefined and not known. There may be spaces where anyone else's pain just triggers you. So trauma in many ways can be embedded, and many a times, the default is that, you don't really engage. You don't engage too much with it. Another sign of trauma is when you possibly, read about someone's trauma and you're not impacted at all. like there's an emotional blunting that is also because of trauma. Where if you read about, very, very difficult, very, difficult or sad or horrific situations, actually, that's the word, horrific situations, and you still do not, nothing happens to you, you don't feel it or you don't think, and you just say, oh, life is usual, then you know that, there is trauma embedded in it. And many a times people can't differentiate burnout from trauma, but a trauma has very definite signs of the triggers that can happen. The hypervigilance being the most important one, where there is a very heightened reaction to something that may not merit that. And since you gave me only 2 minutes, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Arvinder and Professor Dwight. I think this was a wonderful session. So much learning in it for all of us. I think I was totally engrossed throughout. It's an odd time of the day for you, Professor Dwight, so it was wonderful to have you here. And also, let's keep celebrating more such. I wish you a lot of success. I think your center is doing some fantastic work. We personally, the outreach team at Ashoka has benefited a lot from your wonderful work, Dr. Arvinder. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks a lot.
A big thank you. And I hope you know that you're one of the very popular presenters on, for the sessions that we do. You're highly in demand, especially considering the times that we are all going through. So thank you for all your support. It means a lot to all of us and to the audience. And I'll end now. We have a little information that we would like to share. So for any queries on the undergraduate program at Ashoka University, please call 01140747565 or write to apply at ashoka.edu.in. The undergraduate admissions at Ashoka open on 4th of October and round 1 closes on 10th of November 2021. So anyone interested in applying, please pass the good word. The applications are going to open for the next academic year. Thank you, Professor Jagged, and thank you so much, Dr. Arvinder. It was wonderful. Wish you all the best. Stay healthy, stay safe, everyone, and please reach out whenever you need help, because I think that's the key to it, to good mental health.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed.
Parmi, thank you so much.
Thank you.